Hi everyone, I'm David Pompiani, and if you've been watching my channel, you may have noticed that I have an interest in the Ice Age Americas and the peopling of America early on. It's just something I've been fascinated by. I think it's an overlooked field, and I think a lot of people in the public are interested in what exactly was here when people arrived in North America, in South America. But when we think about that question, it brings up other issues. How did they arrive? What kind of technology did they use? Like boats? Were they hunting? Were they adapted to fishing? Did they come along the ice or did they come along the sea? Did they walk in? To explore some of these questions, I brought on the channel Lauren Davis, a professor at Oregon State who studies archaeological sites that are older than 12,000 years. And Matthew de Lauriers is a professor at Cal State San Bernardino, and he's led excavations on the Baja coast where he's looked at Cedros Island and some of the earliest fish hooks found in the Americas. So, welcome, guys, to the channel. It's good to see both of you. Lauren's been on the channel before, and we talked about the white sands and the early footprints out there, supposedly maybe 20,000 years old. But to start us off, I have a broad question. I think that just to kick us off, what is the earliest reliably dated evidence for human presence in North America? In both of your opinions, including islands that will be adjacent to the coasts of the North America.
Well, opinions vary about this. There's a lot of things you can choose from. I like to think about in terms of the earliest, best sort of evidence that we have that's really robust is stuff that includes they have to be in buried context. That is, I need to find them in their original sort of geological package. I need to understand them in place. I need to find something really good to date that goes along with them, something organic that we can leave behind, or sometimes you can use inorganic stuff, but organic's best. And then I also want to find evidence of human presence in the form of things like artifacts that they left behind. And so when you look at those kind of criteria, there's a series of sites in North America that are around the vintage of about 16,000 years ago, maybe a little bit older than that, that include there's a site in Texas called Galt and Friedkin. These are really close to each other, and they show us really great examples of stone tool technology very early. There's sites like Meadowcroft Rock Shelter in Pennsylvania. There's Cactus Hill. I don't need to go through all the list, but there's a series of these that include sites like Cooper's Ferry, where I work in Western Idaho. The Nez Perce call this Napaha. It's a village site in their oral history in Western Idaho. And so what is important about these sites is it shows us lots of great artifactual evidence with really lots of good ages together. But what they are not showing us necessarily are some of the things you touched on. That is answers to questions about how did people get here? Because they're interior. And we don't think that people, developed millions and millions of years ago in North America. We think that scientifically, we think that people are later arrivers. Now, indigenous peoples have other points of view, of course, and we should always respect these things. And sometimes there's opportunities where science and traditional perspectives can come together and talk about the same things. But the past is a hard place to understand, and so we always have to hedge our bets and understand we're not going to know everything. Matt, what do you think, Matt?
Well, I mean, the resident geoarchaeologist on our team is Dr. Davis, so I defer to him on a lot of these larger questions of dating. But I think the logic of it is very sound. You need to have a combination of evidence at one location. For example, out here in Southern California in the desert, you can find artifacts on the surface of the Mojave Desert, and people say, oh, it's this style or it's that style, but it's not going to give you anything to date. And sometimes you'll find things to date, but there's not, a whole lot of convincing evidence of artifacts. For example, in Brazil, the Pedra Furada rock shelter, the dates are probably good, but The artifacts are naturally broken cobbles falling off the cliff face. In the case of White Sands, there's footprints, but there's no artifacts, and there's some problems with the selection of samples for the dating, as I'm sure Dr. Davis probably already talked about on previous episode. So I think the idea is you need to find those contexts that in one place allow you to triangulate these different lines of evidence if you really want it to be convincing. And those are few and far between. But, science is hard. If it was easy, everybody would do it. So I think the idea here is that there are going to be a few of these locations, and we need to really pay attention to what the evidence at these locations is telling us. And just presence absence isn't really going to give us a complete story of the entry of people into the hemisphere. We're going to need more than just simple presence absence evidence.
Okay, so where would you put the earliest, in your estimation, the combination of everything you said? You need the presence of a tool with dating and context. What would you put the age at in calibrated calendar radiocarbon years?
I think the
And for
combination of
nothing.
sites that Dr. Davis talked about, I think consistently what that pattern is showing us is that it's post late glacial maximum. So it's
Okay.
after the beginning of the recession of the continental ice sheets. It's very soon after that, but I don't yet, in my personal professional opinion, see convincing evidence for pre-LGM sites in the Americas at the moment.
Okay.
New evidence can always emerge, but at the moment, I think it's all post-LGM.
Uh, so we're on board with it all being about 16,000 to 16,500 years before present.
So usually we talk about a window of, like he mentioned, last glacial maximum. You might say something like sometime the earliest peoples might be appearing sometime between
Mhm.
20,000 to 16,000. It's somewhere in that window because
Okay.
we're never going to be able to find the very first evidence. That's
Yeah,
unlikely.
yeah.
So
But that's where the window is going, and like the solid dates like that are in context with an artifact that's clearly made by humans. It's a nice radiocarbon date, been calibrated with the most recent
yeah,
calibration is like 16,000.
yeah, it's around 16,000.
Or
So
maybe, yeah. But
yeah,
I
yeah,
know there it had to have been there before.
yes,
Clearly people have got, it took
yeah.
a while for them to get there.
It's at least 16,000, but probably not older than 20 is maybe one
Okay.
thing. That's
Because I'm just,
a
yeah, because like imagine you're just sitting with your family at holiday and you're like, I'm sitting with two experts, archaeologists in early American migrations. And this is what they think is when the earliest people came is like 16,000 years. Because the reason I bring that up is the world, we got to imagine the world of 16,000 years ago to the LGM. So we have the Cordilleran ice sheet, we have the Laurentide ice sheet. They're at their maximum extent. Their lowest latitudinal elevation is during around 20,000 years ago. And so all of Canada is covered in ice. There's just completely covered in ice. So if we have dates from 16,000 years ago in North America, that means that people either walked over the ice or somehow went around the ice to get to those inland sites. And the easiest, going over the ice that's miles and miles thick, doesn't seem possible. So it seems like people must have, if the dates are 16,000 years ago, must have boated in. And this
yeah.
is what the data is starting to show, that because before there was this idea that there was this ice-free corridor, but this ice-free corridor is dated to periods that opened up at younger periods, something like 12,000 years ago, something like that.
It could be as early as 14, but it's even so, that's not early enough to explain people
So it
south of
dates
the ice.
before the ice-free corridor opens. And so that changed kind of the existing paradigm of archaeologists that have been held for a few decades. On the coast, we have some very good evidence for these early migrations. And I'm really interested in just exploring the question of who these people were. These must have been people that had mastered the sea, that had traveled vast distances. They were in cold oceans. They probably followed the coast of Alaska, right? I mean, I don't, they weren't blown off course like iguanas, like I talked about on this channel, for 7,000 miles and landed on the coast. They probably came across from Alaska, right?
Yeah, it couldn't have been a Gilligan's Island situation. You need a lot more people than that. So,
Mm-hmm.
Well, and plus, I think the other thing that people should keep in mind is that this wasn't even in the minds of the people at the time that were actually participants in this movement, as we think about it, of population. They're not actually setting out to get anywhere in particular. This isn't, they don't have Google Earth. They don't know, oh, if we just go a little bit further down this way, there's a great place over here. They're moving along a coastline, which, if our hypothesis is correct, that people engaging in that kind of movement must have had substantial knowledge prior to starting out. They're living along the coasts and islands of Northeast Asia, we know, prior to any evidence of people in the Americas. There's occupations on the islands of Japan and the Ryukyu Islands and south of there, well before we see any evidence of people in the Americas. So we know there's people who have experience with coastlines and maritime resources in sort of what we put on the maps as kind of the staging area, if you will, for movement into the Western Hemisphere. And so these people were moving into environments and exploiting resources in environments rather than having any sort of end destination in mind. And they were being driven by a combination of push and pull factors in this movement as well.
Warren, do you want to?
well, I mean, I agree with these ideas that if we are thinking about people coming into the Americas, you couldn't have walked through an ice-free corridor at 16,000. It just didn't exist. So we just simply, this is how archaeology works, is we need to make arguments because we weren't there, right? So
Mhm.
we're going to look at the data and say, even though we can't find a site every 100 meters from the Pacific Northwest of the U.S. all the way around the Pacific Rim to Northeast Asia, that is not what we require. We just simply might make a couple arguments about, we know that people are in Northeast Asia. We know that the peoples of the Americas are most closely genetically related in history to those people. So there's a connection. And you couldn't walk through the ice. So it's probably just the most parsimonious explanation. The simplest argument is that they probably came along the coast.
Okay.
And there was like Matt said, there's an ocean where they came from also. So it's not like they had to invent these whole ideas about how to interact with the ocean world.
Yeah, yeah. It wasn't like they were necessarily, like you said, they may not even have known they were going anywhere new at the time. Like this kind of were, yeah, exploring.
And much like in the case of Polynesia, from the Hawaiian perspective, people went from island to island, and it wasn't their first rodeo. They knew what an island was. They knew what kinds of limitations there were. And so by the time people arrive in Hawaii, they're exceptionally good, at that process of settlement of these remote and restricted geographies. And so similar kinds of things would have accelerated any sort of movement in the Americas, as well as people became more familiar with the specifics of a location. Even though they had the generalities already in hand, it would have, created momentum, which may be something that explains the from the archaeology perspective, from the dating methods that we use and the resolution that we get there. It seems an incredibly rapid movement of people into the Americas. But Lewis and Clark only reached Loren's neck of the woods, what, you know, 225 years ago? So
Yeah. So
that, that's,
that's a
that's,
good point. This rapidness. And if we just step back and look at broader Homo sapiens as a genus, why didn't they, for example, figure out that coastal route 80,000 years ago? You think that could have happened, right? There were people in Asia 80,000, 90,000 ish years ago. But all of a sudden, during a window, probably 16 to 20,000 years ago, they start coming. Um, and the ice sheet is at its maximum, so it's not an ice sheet thing. Maybe the LGM itself was the impetus to push them or something. But so they had, who were those people? Where did they come from? What can we tell about the origins of their culture in Asia? Are there any, let's say, lithic technologies that we find along the coast of North America that match or are closely resembling tools we find in like Asia? And what were those people like? Can anyone talk about that?
Well, yeah. So we do know, as I mentioned, that the peoples of the Americas are most closely related genetically to the peoples of Northeast Asia. So that just implies in the whole genetic family tree that they share some kind of common history deeper in the past. And scientists have worked this out, that it's around this window of time that we've been talking about, or sometime close to 20,000 years ago, there's a split that happens and people they leave Northeast Asia and become isolated somewhere and then eventually make their way into the Americas. We don't really know the details of that stuff, how that all happens. That's all dependent on finding more and more skeletal materials to study in different places. And until that happens, then we can still keep talking about where might people have come from, but we have to do it from another perspective. And as you mentioned, it's looking at things like artifacts. Now, it isn't the artifacts themselves that are important. Like two artifacts don't get together and have offspring of other artifacts. It's that they represent the material representations of ideas. And we can think of this as culture. And so these are technical knowledge programs we have in our head on how to do something like turn a block of rock into something useful like a spear point. And to do that, you're not born knowing how to do that. You have to actually learn it and you have to be taught by somebody. And so when we make comparisons between, let's say, the earliest sites that have stone tools in North America and we look to Northeast Asia, we're looking at examples where they're very similar because what we think that might mean is that we're actually discovering nodes in a network of transmission of knowledge. Like these people shared these ideas. Now, how did they go from Northeast Asia to the Americas? Well, that's harder to know. We don't know that. But in the meantime, what we can say is that right now, myself and some other colleagues, we've been writing about this for a while, and we think that it's the area that represents sort of northern Japan. And then there's some islands to the north of there that are part of Russian national territory. And this is known as Paleo Sakhalin Hokkaido Kuril, which is a real mouthful. So we just say PSHK. And really what this is it's just sort of the northwestern part of the Pacific Rim. That's that area. And so this also encompasses part of what's called East Asia. So it would be the Russian Maritime region. It would be part of Korea and China and places like this. So that's just that part of the world. If you look at early sites there that are older than this window of 16 to 20,000 years, they just look very, very, very similar. And we don't just mean like the 2D outline. We mean like the 3D form. And just really quickly, I'll just give you an example. So the thing that we always take for granted in archaeology in the Americas is that everybody knew how to make a thing we call a biface. And we don't think what a biface is. A biface is like a spear point, or a smaller version is like an arrowhead. And it just has two sides to it and it has a convergent margin like a knife edge. That kind of thing has not been made forever by people. In fact, it's, as far as we can tell, in our part of the world, it only appears around the last glacial maximum. So the earliest example of it appears in actually Japan between roughly 23,000 to 20,000 years or so. But in northern Japan, it's about 20,000 years. And it looks incredibly similar to bifaces, projectile points found at these earliest sites, 16,000 or so. All right, so we just make an argument. We say maybe that's the link. Maybe this shows a cultural connection between these groups. Is it migration of people or is it transmission of ideas? Well, we don't really know. but we do think that there's a link there somehow. And the fun part is we get to explore it and try to figure it out. So,
And I'll just segue right off of that. In addition to these similarities from Japanese territory in the lithic technology that Loren and his colleagues in Japan have been examining and using some really cool 3D scanning to really get into the quantifiable, three-dimensional similarities between these things and producing a library. I recommend anybody interested in archaeology to really expand their understanding of 3D scanning that has allowed them to really define these similarities. Also, from Japanese territory, we have evidence for some of the earliest incontrovertible fish hooks. Evidence for hook and line fishing in the world is also from Japanese territory, in this case, from the Ryukyu Islands, just south of the Japanese home islands. There's evidence for these hooks going back at least 24,000 years ago from a site called Sakitari Cave on the island of Okinawa. And there's also pre-LGM or peri-LGM, right at the late glacial maximum, evidence for these hooks from a wide area of the East Asian littoral. Indonesia, in particular, has a number of sites that have on various islands of Indonesia. The Philippines has a couple of examples. So across this wide area of maritime territory in East Asia, we see the appearance of incontrovertible evidence for hook and line fishing. And it's all in that ballpark that is, interestingly enough, right before the window that Loren was talking about for the movement of people into the Americas. Loren was saying between 20 and 16 is kind of the window that we're looking at for movement of people into the Americas. Well, this evidence that we're seeing for clear maritime adaptations and development of specialized technology, and that's a really key thing if we're talking about evidentiary basis, is specialized technology for these things, because anybody with the zero technology can figure out that you can pull a mussel off of the rocks and eat it. I mean, there are non-human primates that actually eat shellfish off the beach. So that doesn't, just finding a handful of shell in a site does not mean that you've got a maritime adaptation. But the evidence that we're actually seeing is that we have a clear and well-defined maritime adaptation in the littoral of East Asia, certainly well established by 25 to 20,000 years ago. And then we see, based upon the genetics, based upon the linguistics, based upon a whole bunch of other lines of scientific evidence, always with the deepest of respect for the native perspectives on things, but the scientific lines of evidence strongly suggest that we have a movement of populations from that geography on the Western Pacific and then over here to the geography on the eastern side of the Pacific. And the fact that we have evidence for this maritime adaptation in the West, and then some of the earliest sites that we have, certainly for the geography that I'm an expert on, Baja California, the earliest sites that we know about contain not only evidence for maritime adaptation, but evidence for this specialized technology. That in and of itself isn't a sufficient amount to conclude definitively, but it is very suggestive that we're looking at a movement of people using common technologies and common systems of knowledge about the ocean and how to harvest its resources.
So I'm in a cave on the beach in Hawaii, and I'm taking a moment to remind you to please subscribe to this channel to support science communication so that I can get more interviews done, get better stories out there, and we can hopefully transform how science is brought to the public. Thank you. Okay, so in a way, both of you are saying you're seeing an emergence of new technologies. First, the biface, the stemmed lithic biface, which replaced, I'm assuming, maybe a hand axe or something like this as the dominant lithic technology, or maybe a broader spear point.
Yeah, so it's not so much about the, like you said, stem. It's the business end. It's that three-dimensional form of the blade. That
Okay.
is a new invention that happens around the last glacial. Prior to that, people are using other approaches. I mean, like literally tying sharp, pointy flakes, like shards of glass on. I mean, they're not very sophisticated in their three-dimensional form. And there's some other versions, but the idea that the thing that we all take for granted, like someone thinks of a Clovis point, like a Clovis spear point, killing mammoths. That technology did not exist very much before the last glacial maximum, and definitely not way north. It's mostly in coastal Asia.
That's
And
really interesting. And then
That's a big deal.
that's the first thing. And then the second thing you're saying, Matt, has brought up, is then you see the development of fishing technology, specifically hooks, specifically for deep sea, because you're not just on the coast gathering or even spearing things in the shallow water on the reef.
correct.
So we have both a lithic technology, a fishing technology emerges at the LGM. Then we see them start this migration, or it's a coincides with it, at least, let's say. Um, but that is a very interesting new, way to look at it. I haven't thought about it like that. So that might explain why, we don't see people showing up 80,000 years ago or 70, or,
Quite
randomly. Yeah,
quite possibly. I mean, it may
possibly.
also
Yeah.
be connected to other kinds of, again, specialized technology, because we don't see people north of the Arctic Circle. Last I checked, Lauren, that was Barilac. That's what, 28, something like that. I'm trying to remember the date on that specifically, but
In Asia,
in anywhere north of the Arctic Circle.
So this
really.
area that we know of as Beringia, it's sort of the northeastern part of Russia. It extends at a land bridge across the Pacific to Alaska. That area was not occupied, as far as we can tell, archaeologically by people during the last glacial period. So there are no archaeological sites sort of between this window of roughly 30,000 years to 14,500 or so. And so there's a huge gap, and everyone understands this, and opinions vary about why that is. I mean, it's a big place. It's not easy to work there. Maybe there are sites there we haven't found them, whatever. But if there are sites there, I don't think it's like what we see along the coast of East Asia, where there's over 1,000 archaeological sites in Japan that are in the Pleistocene. They're 12,000 years and older. I mean, they can't find one in Beringia. So, I mean, the point is that there's a lot of people in certain parts of the world during the last glacial period. Other parts of the world apparently are not great places to live. And humans are pulling away from those places, we think.
Mhm.
So just to connect, it could be that it was only until these very key technologies were invented that people were able to make a move
Mm.
during some of these harsh environments. They could make the move. And then you stay along the coast is less harsh than the interior. And it's a very familiar environment that people can just keep extending their skills along the way.
One of the big technologies that even I think is certainly still honored in northern latitude traditional societies that we tend to forget a lot is the sewing needle.
Yeah.
Because to survive in both these cold and alternately wet situations, it'd be really, really helpful to have waterproof boots so your feet don't freeze off. And without the ability to produce waterproof clothing that is capable of preserving life and limb in Arctic conditions, it would have been exceptionally difficult for anybody to make that passage, no matter how sturdy they were. Frostbite comes for everybody, and the ability to have the technology to fight that off would have been key. And without that technology, you're not making it, period.
It would have been key, especially because we're talking 20,000 to 16,000. This is pretty much during the last glacial maximum, the coldest period in the last 100,000 years that they're making this move. So it's cold today. Now imagine that like 10 degrees C colder on average. But at least you're on the coast. The ocean is moderating the temperature. Now you have fish hooks that you can exploit deeper water, so you can be maybe in your boat on the move, exploiting calorically dense foods and on the move. That would have been huge. But first, before we get there, I do want to raise the issue here is the coast would have looked a lot different back 16 to 20,000 years ago, just for people out there listening. We're talking, I think around 20,000 years ago, sea level on average was 120 meters lower than it is today. So the coast, the shapes of the islands, the Aleutian Islands, and not to mention lots of probably early Pleistocene sites or, Pleistocene era sites are underwater today. And so the shapes of those islands would look different. The coastlines would have looked different. Some sites are definitely underwater. We have to keep that in mind because there is a rapid sea level from, at the end of the late Pleistocene. But anyway, the people that are coming and they are using fishing technology. So we must have found some hooks, right? That approve this, right? And also I want to maybe keep this in mind too, if you're both thinking about it. What kind of fishing line were they making or using to make those deep water lines that are strong? I mean, but anyway, Matt, tell me, I know Cedros in the Baja, it's 28 degrees north. I double checked before this because that's pretty far south, a little bit north of Hawaii. It's tropical. It was island off. Yeah. Anyway, it's an island that they found very early human presence in North America, specifically you and your colleagues. So can you tell me about what was found there, why it's unique, and what does it tell us about the technology of the peopling of America?
Sure. Well, Cedros is a fascinating place geographically because at the beginning of the story that we've been telling here, so right around this LGM period, it was probably connected to the mainland as the end of a very long extended peninsula. Today, it's 23 kilometers offshore. And so, very, you know, appropriately, you mentioned how much transformation of the landscape has occurred since we're talking about. But there's some things about this place that don't change. One is that there's more water on Cedros than there is on the adjacent mainland, which is a very unusual circumstance, but it's because it's a flooded mountain of a longer mountain chain. And so the mountain chain brings down the aquifer from landmass, and then on Cedros, it sort of gets pushed up by the water pressure of the ocean around it. So it has more available water than just about any place for 200 miles in either direction. So that makes it very attractive. And so when people arrived here early on, it would have been probably one of the best spots for people to settle. What we have found from the earliest sites on Cedros that demonstrate an absolute emphasis on marine resources, despite the fact that the island is also home to both deer and rabbit populations. Over 97+% of the fauna that we see in the sites on Cedros is maritime, is aquatic resources from the ocean. There's very, very little in the way of the terrestrial fauna. And we have fishhooks that are both in form and material very, very similar to ones from the Western Pacific, as well as very, very similar in form and manufacture to ones from both Peru, Ecuador, and northern Chile, sort of completing kind of a coastwise distribution, also from ones further south just in the Baja California Peninsula. So it seems to us that there is a very early, widespread tradition of hooks in the Eastern Pacific along the western coast of the Americas. The interesting thing from an archaeological standpoint and anthropological standpoint is that these sites don't have evidence for one or two species of fish. What was the last count, Lauren? Over 50 different taxa of fish are being exploited at these very, very early sites, as well as various species of pinnipeds, both sea lions and fur seals. Sea turtles are being harvested extensively at these sites, as well as every possible species of mollusk. We have some of the earliest, this is fun too, we have some of the earliest evidence for the exploitation of lobster in the Americas and crab. Literally, I cannot think of a species that I'm aware of that's in that water, even today, that's not in these assemblages. They are exploiting the full spectrum of maritime resources, which indicates they know how to harvest it. There's not only fish that are caught by hook and line, but there's very small fish that had to be caught by nets. There's very large fish that may have been caught by harpoons because some of them have jaw structures that don't work for hooks. Like it's very difficult to catch a shark on a shellfish hook. Try it sometime. So they are showing and demonstrating a capacity for maritime adaptation and skill that is unparalleled even in other early sites along the Pacific coast of the Americas. Even early sites in Peru that have evidence for the exploitation of aquatic resources have a much more restricted range of species that they're exploiting. And so this is one of the things that sets Cedros's assemblages and sites apart from any others. And then to answer your question in terms of fiber, we've actually found the lithic tools that they were using to scrape agave fibers to pulp out the fiber from these leaves, and they are one of the most common tools in the lithic assemblages of these sites. In fact, they are the thing that lets you know you've found an early site on Cedros, is that you're finding these fiber processing tools for making fiber, for making cordage, for making nets, and all of those things. That's really the thing that kind of lets you know you've found an early site, because they are so dominant in the assemblage, indicating these people are making a lot of fiber to support this maritime adaptation. And anybody who's ever been to a fishing village or even a dock where they're doing more traditional kinds of shipping and boating knows it's just everywhere. This is the kind of definitional technology for maritime and fishing communities. And we determine this by doing experimental replications of these tools and scraping different materials and then getting the signature for what that looked like in terms of the wear on the tools. And then we were even able, under microscopic examination, to identify the silica development on these tools, and found on two examples from the archaeological site evidence of agave fiber actually embedded in that silica gloss on these tools, letting us know that at least one of the major uses for these tools was that fiber processing. And that was a huge thing to be able to define that, because again, much like the sewing needles that I mentioned earlier, it's one of those tools that seldom gets the same level of attention as projectile points or the hooks themselves, because it's seen as being, oh well, that's just work, that's not, it's not the hunt or the fish or whatnot. But it is the element that enables all the rest of the system to and so it was really fascinating to be able to connect these things together in that kind of champ operatoire.
It explains so much. The journey itself through the northern latitudes, along the coast of Alaska today, during the LGM, was probably pretty devoid of life, I guess, beyond maybe mammals like seals or walruses. So if you were boating, there probably was more resources in the deep water that you can maybe sustain yourself through some of these, like, especially, I don't know, harsh areas as you're moving. That just one thought. I'm not sure if that makes total sense. But the Cedros Island stuff. So what's the early radiocarbon dated evidence calibrated for the remains at Cedros, including fish hooks? Or is it, unless they're separate, like evidence for people and fish hooks?
What do we want to? You're the geo.
Well, so I mean, when we try to answer that question, we can look at things like what do we think is the best evidence? And I mentioned before, it's like we need to find objects that relate to people, having done things. Well, one of the things that we find is that we sometimes will find pieces of shell in deposits that are miles and miles and miles inland away from where the ocean would have been at lower sea level. And we find enough of these sometimes in sites, even if we're not finding stone tools with them, that we interpret this to mean this represents people bringing marine shell inland, because you don't need stone tools to harvest shellfish. I mean, those two things don't go together. Unlike, hunting mammals or things, typically there's some kind of stone tools involved. But I guess what I would get to is that we have ages now in excess of 13,000 calendar BP
Hmm.
calendar years ago that we think are very likely indicating people moving shell from the interior. In terms of shell hooks, the earliest examples, we haven't directly dated all these. Some of them are very beautiful, unique examples. So we date the context we find them in. And Matt, what is I'm trying to remember. I'd have to look it up, but
Well, I would have to check the exact numbers, but I think we're on the order of 12.8 at this.
yes. So, by some people's accounting, essentially we have found Clovis aged hooks,
Okay.
which people will all, sometimes they get really fixated on hunting of megafauna, but some of these hooks, I have to point out, are designed for megafauna. You know, like
Big fish.
a 10 gauge hook. For those of you listening who know things about fishing, 10 gauge hooks are almost literally the size of like my forefinger and thumb. And these are designed for really big game fish and sharks, marlins and billfish, stuff like that. I mean, that is a tremendous amount of work. And we actually have found shark remains in our archaeological sites. So if people, not that we're using shell hooks for this, but it's not like there's no risk. Some of these animals want to eat you too.
Yeah.
So that's also something to think about. It's not just that easy. Plus, it's dangerous as hell to be out there on the ocean
But
sometimes.
yeah, definitely.
And they're bringing in. We also know that they are landing fish. What was the estimate on the size of that one? It's called a giant black sea bass, but folks in Hawaii will be more. It's part of the grouper family, so you're talking about a large grouper. And the faunal analysts estimated, based on the size of the vertebra that we were pulling out, that it would have been at least a 400-pound grouper.
So people are catching fish bigger than people and hauling them up with hand lines. So if you
Yeah.
want an example, if you really want a rich sort of visual to go with this, just read the book, Old Man in the Sea, and it's essentially battles like that these people are probably engaged in to get these fishes.
And that means they had very strong fishing line with this agave fiber. How long do you think these lines could have been, and how thick would have the rope been or line?
Interestingly enough, agave fiber is other than silk. So, in terms of plant based fiber, agave fiber has the strongest tensile strength of any plant fiber out there. This is why, like, even within the, relatively recent history, those henequen plantations that were used to make rope and fiber and whatnot are species of agave. The other thing that makes them really great for making very strong cordage is that if you can think about and for the listeners, agave's century plants, if you know it by that name, and they have those very very long pointy leaves. Well, the thing is that the fibers are the full length of the leaf. They
Mm.
run all the way from the base to the tip, and that's even longer than cotton fibers, for example. And so if you're talking about making line, the more overlapping you can make those fibers, the more overlap there is when you twist them into cordage, the stronger that's going to be. And so they are also used even today for making ropes for lashing and sealing boxes and whatnot, because the characteristics of the fibers themselves actually make them a little bit like cellophane. They like to stick to themselves. And so if you're trying to lash something together and you want that knot to hold, agave fiber is actually going to be preferable to any synthetic or other natural fiber. So they're very strong. They're very good at holding their knots. just based upon the character of the natural plant fiber itself. For example, and in terms of their resilience to exposure, folks may not know, but the lienzo of the Virgin of Guadalupe that's there in Mexico City, which is over 500 years old, that's actually on agave fiber cloth. And so it lasts a long, long time, just again based on the strength and resilience of that material.
So from the fish that you found, can you tell how deep these lines could have gone? Maybe if you were going there,
Yeah, absolutely.
or brief
Yeah,
quickly, I
briefly,
guess.
some of the species that we find, one example is ocean whitefish, which not only tells us a lot about where they're fishing, but is delicious, especially in ceviche. It's a deep water tilefish. It does not feed on the surface. It's mostly a bottom feeder that live outside the kelp line in deep water rocky reefs. And so just by looking at the maps that have been generated by Loren and Alex Nyers and other colleagues that we work with, we're able to show that they had to be at least 2 kilometers offshore in order to be able to access the kind of water and substrate environments that these species of fish live in. And if you're 2 kilometers offshore, that also means you have to have a seaworthy boat. And so they're fishing from not just a plank, that they're kind of paddling out on, but you've got to have a real boat. And they're fishing in deep water environments from boats as early as we're able to measure in these sites.
So how deep?
Um, Up to these fish you're looking at ranges, what is it, 80 to 90 feet for their typical range. And they can be found up to, I'll have to look at but they can go down to over 150, 180 feet is the deep range, depending upon
Wow.
season.
Wow. That's in these lines would have been, as thick as your pinky or thinner, or have
Uh,
you found any bits of lines, dated them?
we have found line, but not from this time period.
Okay.
So we have found line from sites on the island, but dating to more recent contexts. But what is fascinating about the line that you're able to produce from these later contexts is that it can be incredibly thin, and then it's not just a single twist of cordage, but then you take those thin cords and then you twist it into a 3-ply kind of thing that would still be, no thicker than, the USB cord, that you have
Yeah.
for, that you're talking about something that's already 3-ply, but it's still maybe, a third of a centimeter in diameter. And so they're able to produce line that's very strong and relatively thin for its strength. Whereas in other places that we see folks making cordage along the Pacific coast, they have to use, like you're saying, very, very thick line for fishing, which limits the length that you can make it, which limits the flexibility, and certainly limits the depths at which they're able to fish. I mean, this is one thing that we see even later in time, comparing, say, Alta California contexts from Baja California, where they're using different materials for fishing. We're able to show that the native Baja Californians were able to fish deeper in deeper water contexts than folks in Alta California. And this is probably due to the quality of the fibers they had available to make their line with.
Hmm.
So
Cool.
just to add a little bit factoid here, I had done a little bit of research on the tensile strength of these different strand things. So a 3-strand agave rope or sisal rope, in my research, it came up with 865 foot-pounds of tensile strength. So 800,
865.
865, a 3-strand rope.
So
Wow. Wait, that's way stronger because when you do fishing for like trout, you're using like 6-pound tests, 8-pound tests.
Yeah, well,
Is
that's
that a,
also extremely thin. So if you were to take your 6 pound line and weave it into a 3 strand, you know what I mean.
yeah,
So
yeah,
you can make an 865 pound, foot pound strength line. Anyway,
yeah,
hopefully,
with that.
if some of your readers might go, that's ridiculous. They may, but look it up, I guess.
Well,
So
that's, I mean, you can pull in a shark with that. That makes sense if you could pull in a huge animal with an 865-pound
well,
test, let's say.
you're gonna need a really strong line to pull up some of the fishes that we have actually measured. So we know that there's at least minimum strengths. Like a 400-pound black sea bass. I'm sure when you pull it up, it's like it's not just 400 pounds because the thing's fighting you.
Yeah,
So it's got to be a lot stronger.
And
Also, I wanted to say another thing. Sorry, is that the places where we find like the ocean whitefish and some of these, it's on the southern part of Cedros Island, and given the shape of the continental shelf, the people there likely had to paddle out to places. There are some places there where you have to paddle out to something that's close to the edge of the horizon. So sitting in a boat, you're going to go out to places where you cannot see that place from the island. You have to paddle out to that spot. It's over the curvature of the earth, because of the way the curvature of the earth works. So that's just another thing too to remember, is that these people have this very complex three-dimensional understanding of where to go to get this specific fish, and they have to bring the right tools with them. So this traditional ecological knowledge is incredibly interesting and complex, very, very early. So even
mhm,
though we can't say that we have found 16,000-year-old fishing technology, we know that by just about, 13, almost 13,000 years ago, people already know how to do these incredibly complex things, visualizing, taking animals you can't see from the surface over the edge of the world.
yeah.
It's wild to think
It's
about that.
complete. It's wild. And so you mentioned the dating. Or earlier we said the evidence for humans in America are 16,000 roughly and a little bit older, but the fishing hooks, the earliest dates you said are around 12,000. Just for
almost
my own,
13.
yeah, I know they were developed before, but it could
Oh yeah, almost 13, but yeah.
almost 13. Just so I'm all like thinking, so 13,000. And those hooks are at Cedros, and that they must have been using the fishing line at that point.
We don't think that we found the first example of it. We have just
Right,
found
right,
the earliest example, and when we dig to the bottom of these sites, there's just no more record. So
right,
it
right.
could be if we find earlier sites somewhere else, we'll be able to extend this, hopefully, to 16 and beyond, and that's the goal.
Now,
And
if you take, okay, go ahead, Matthew.
real quickly, I was just going to say to Lauren's point is that we don't just have one site on Cedros that dates to this time period. We have a whole number of these
Hmm.
that are all within sight of each other. Like you could stand on one site and you can see these other sites that are dated to this early time period. So it seems like at this point that we're finding this evidence, the island is already well settled. So the idea that there wouldn't be earlier examples is more of a stretch. And so we definitely expect to be able to extend the evidence for the occupation of this island back further than we have already, given the density of information from this sort of time period.
Okay, yeah, and that makes total sense. Yeah, and but we could say we're solidly at 13,000 years, which is still fantastic. I mean, for the site, that's really old. And if you take, let's say, one of the shell hooks from that time period, and then you go to a shell hook from Hokkaido area or somewhere in Asia, were they Okinawa? How closely do they resemble each other? Are they very similar, or are they? What would you say?
We wanted to be careful about this, right, Lauren? So to just at just a superficial level, without making any dramatic claims, if you took one of the hooks from Sakitari and dropped it onto the surface of the site of that we one of the sites that we've been working at, I'm not sure that we would know it was not from there. Is that a good way to say it,
Yeah,
Lauren?
Yeah, I mean, that's without doing a lot of without have done the things that we need to do, but I would agree with you. And what I mean by this is that it's not just the shape of the hook that's important, because sometimes shells break in a way that kind of have a natural analog to hooks, but that's not good enough to catch a fish because you actually have to do a whole bunch of other steps to manufacture the thing to a very specific design. And so what I would want to see is, are the hooks from Okinawa, are they designed the same way? Are they manufactured the same way? And are they used the same way to catch similar fishes? And if that's the case, then I would say you're looking at basically the transport of an entire suite of complex ideas from one place possibly to another. Or they got invented independently, I guess, maybe, but it's like, man, that is really complex stuff. That's really hard to imagine given everything else we know about the connections between these two regions.
Can you describe what do these hooks look like for someone that has never seen them? I Googled it real quick before I talked to you both, but describe how big they are, the kind of species. Did they bait them? They clearly tied them with agave line.
Yeah,
You know what I'm
they
talking about?
they're using, in the case of Cedros, they're using mussel and abalone. In the case of Okinawa, the same. They're using both abalone and mussel there, trochus shell as well. And these are two different kind of patterns that we see in the assemblage. Some of them are more of a J shape, and others have more of a kind of exaggerated crescent moon circular shape, right? So, like a C, sort of a C shaped where it kind of closes around that. We see both designs in the assemblages on Cedros. And the way that they're selecting the portion of the shell that they're using the growth lines of the shell to make it as strong as possible. So because it's a laminate material, the abalone and mussel shell is not like clamshell. It's a little bit different in terms of its composition. They're trying to take advantage of that strength of laminate. It's sort of like you can bend a phone book in one dimension, but you can't bend it in the other one, right? Even though it's individual pages are not that strong. And they're then grinding a waste into the shank of that hook rather than putting notches or holes through the shank. They're grinding a waste in there that's kind of like a, dare I say it, Lauren, a saddle, in that they're using to lash the line onto. In addition to that, you asked about sizes. There's a whole range of sizes. Lauren, you had the gauges down. I forget what the full gauge range was, but from very large to very small.
It's like a 10 gauge down to a 5 gauge. And that may not mean much to people, but it's something like the smallest ones are from the tip to the shank kind of distance, this sort of width of them. They're, I don't know, about an inch or so, a little less maybe. And the big ones are, up to 3, 4 inches sometimes, almost, maybe closer to 3 inches. But as you mentioned, some of them are J-shaped and some of them are circular, and this is designed for the specific morphology of the mouths of the fishes. They're not just universal, because some fishes you want to kind of clip onto the corner of their mouth like a bread bag tie. It's sort of like that kind of idea. And then the J ones are for like stabbing through the mouth, and then you put tension and drag them in. It's like a grappling hook. So, or you're going to get him to swallow it. Again, to swallow it, then it's not coming out. It's a bone in the throat kind of thing. So,
Yeah. Wait, so that's interesting how you describe that one, the bread bag approach where it almost clips the cartilage or something
yeah,
around the.
hard lips. They have really hard mouths around the edges. Matt, go ahead.
I was just going to say,
Yeah.
it's sort of like for the listeners that can't see our pantomime here, what we're discussing is that the fish that have mouths that are what are called protrusible, so like goldfish mouths, they have hard mouth parts, but then behind those hard mouth parts are much thinner membranes. And so some of these hooks are designed to hook behind the hard lip and through that thin membrane. And if you can do that, and then all you have to do is maintain tension on the line, the fish isn't going to get away unless it pulls its own mouth off because you're behind the jawbone there.
Hmm.
And it's really effective. And we've actually used experimentally replicated shell hooks on Cedros before it was declared a biosphere reserve. I want that to be clear. In the years before that happened, we actually managed to catch sea bass with shell hooks on the island, and it worked incredibly well. So that was a good confirmation of concept there.
So I think I have a better idea now of what the technology looks like in terms of the fishing and everything. But a question that I've been wondering is, what do the boats look like? Now you're gonna be going across cold water. Cedros is warmish tropical water. I guess I don't know about the current there. Does it bring up cold water? That's not that.
It's cold water.
It's cold water.
It's the same species of shellfish and fish and kelp as you see up in Central California. It's actually
Okay, wow.
colder. It's actually colder off of Cedros than it is off of San Diego, for example, because of the way the current and the localized upwelling at Cedros and other spots on the Baja California Peninsula is actually pretty extreme. Because of the way that the geography interacts with the larger California current and the way that the wind moves across the landscape, creating these upwelling plumes that can be pretty intense, where you get localized areas that can be as much as at El Rosario, it's what, 4 or 5 degrees centigrade cooler in that plume, right, Lauren?
It's colder, that's for sure.
Yeah. And so it's cold. It's and when you said earlier tropical, it's only marginally tropical in a latitudinal sense. If you want
Yeah.
an idea of the landscape, it's a bit more similar to the Mars rover photographs.
Okay, that's a good thing to bring up. We didn't really talk about the geography because I saw it was 28 degrees north, which is a low latitude, but that ocean. So, how would you describe the vegetation? You're saying it's like Mars. It's dry, arid, desert,
Well, for example,
cedar forests.
well, the interesting thing is when I started working there in 2000, the weather station in the town on the island had not recorded precipitation for 2 years, and it didn't record actual falling precipitation for another three. So there went 5 years without rain being recorded at the weather station. But the island was called Wamalgua, Island of the Fogs, by the native people, because you get this really thick and intense marine layer that comes in, and most of the plants there are dependent upon this, including the pines that live on the tops of the mountains. They actually collect their own precipitation on the needles as the marine layer
I
comes in and condenses. It's a very Arrakis kind of situation.
think I've heard of this. Yeah.
Yeah. And it's similar to if you go to the other side of the equator and you go down to southern Peru and northern Chile, you get similar kinds of fog dependent coastal vegetation environments down there. And you get the similar kind of cold water current coming up from the south. So there's these parallel kind of environments. And so if you want to think about Cedros and central Baja California, the best parallel is the Pacific coast of South America, the Atacama and adjacent arid zones of Pacific South America.
Okay. Now, getting back to that boating question. Now, it's climate dependent because I'm thinking, a prehistoric boating person. I'm picturing kayak, canoe, raft with bound together bamboo slash some sort of buoyant wood with fiber. And then, maybe up into including like a wood clad boat, which I would, use to describe something like Egyptians made or the Vikings, let's say. Now, what kind of boat did they have? What did it look like? Was it a kayak, more of a canoe? Do you find evidence? Do you have a boat that we've seen?
We do
'Cause I would like to know about that.
from the later contexts. Obviously, you find a lot more evidence of more recent activity just because of the ravages of time, right? But we do have direct evidence of watercraft from Cedros, both archaeological as well as eyewitness accounts from Spanish explorers in the 15 and 1600s. So we're able to combine the evidence that we've found archaeologically of actual boat fragments with the evidence that we have from the eyewitness accounts to get a pretty good idea of what they're doing. And it's a boat that's incredibly stable, almost, dare I tempt fate with the Titanic reference, but almost unsinkable because of its construction, and but not particularly fast or nimble as the kayaks and other things that you're describing. But the really interesting thing from the late period is that they were able to produce these, and it was confusing even for the Spanish eyewitnesses who had a hard time figuring out what they wanted to call it. And so in their margins, in the different Spanish words, balsa for raft or for canoe, they keep scratching it out and writing the other one in and then scratching it out. And it's like, I don't know what to call this thing.
Yeah.
But you're looking at composite craft that are made with a single hull element of flattened off and rounded underneath log of cedar or redwood. And then they used bundles of smaller pieces of wood along either side to give them balance and freeboard. And then they had, at both ends curved up these bundles. And so in some ways it's this composite craft that kind of combines the Thule balsa or the reed balsa, like you were talking about, Egyptian
Mhm.
and everywhere else, made these. They're very common with the raw material of solid wood. So it's sort of like
Whoa.
you're making a composite craft, but out of solid pieces of wood as opposed to reeds or rushes. And one of the reasons for this, Lauren can talk about the lumber yard.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Tell us about that.
Well, because as you were saying, you were describing this, Matt, you were saying cedar or redwood. And I thought your listeners are going to be like, that's ridiculous. There aren't cedars and redwood on Mars, like an island with, it's like, that's not possible. But as Matt mentioned, there's a lot of currents that come down. The California current comes down Western North America, and everything that's floating in that current is going to get pushed towards Cedros Island. And even on the main part of the peninsula, Baja California, there are tremendous beachcombing areas where things that fall off ships in the North Pacific end up in the desert out there. And that also has been true, we think, for Cedros Island. And at lower sea level, when Cedros Island was connected to the peninsula, we had a really big, broad sort of landscape that probably accumulated wood at a scale that we don't see today. And so we refer to this sometimes as the paleo lumber yard, probably just loads and loads and loads of huge logs from British Columbia, maybe in southern Alaska, definitely from the Pacific Northwest, Northern California, coming down. And people would have had these available to them to use in a place where otherwise you would have a hard time making boats without it. Because, on the peninsula itself, if you go farther south where there's very few trees, they do talk about that there are rafts kind of styles that are used making rafts. But I think if you're going to be fishing out in the ocean, you need something that's more
Yeah.
maneuverable, something that has a design that allows you to push through waves better than a raft, of course. So, less Tom Hanks Castaway, more, I don't know what, more stand-up paddleboard, style. So,
Yeah. Or maybe
yeah.
more Polynesian canoe style, even though this were way later. Because that boat, they use solid logs of palm trees, and they have, for the people that don't know about a Polynesian canoe, you have the center one, then you have like arms that come off and like a little buoyant piece of wood that's parallel to like the main boat that's used to balance. Incredibly stable, and there's evidence they used sails too, and it needed a solid piece of wood. And this is the problem they had on Easter Island, because the idea is they removed all the wood that was able to be used to make deep sea canoes. Hence, they were kind of stuck to these closer environments in the later stages of the Easter Island Polynesian collapse, let's say. So they weren't making things like out of reeds or bundles of stick that, they needed a solid piece of wood and to make the seaworthy vessel to pull things in. And so, yeah, that's a good point. But they had that lumber yards. It's just bringing unique wood to the area.
Yeah. Especially, I mean, and the evidence that this happens was even after the tragedy of the Fukushima tsunami. A ton of Japanese debris washed up on the beach here in Baja California.
Mm, okay.
And
Yeah.
during World War II, some of the older residents would even tell me about how one time they found a torpedo that was still buzzing, and it washed up on the beach, and there'd be fragments of planes. And so anything that goes into the Pacific can theoretically end up here, and eventually probably does.
Wow. So yeah, it's really, that's what's interesting, that it's like it's just, they're getting like exotic goods brought to them in a way at that time.
We even found Japanese glass fishing floats in a rock shelter site that had been flaked and turned into stone tools. Yeah.
So okay, so have you, now you mentioned historically the Spanish saw a boat that
Mhm.
looked like this, and
Yeah.
the Spanish showed up a few hundred years ago. We're talking at this site 12,000 years at Cedros. You find evidence for continuity in the boat making technology all the way from the Pleistocene to the contact. Like,
I mean, I don't know that we have any direct evidence for what the boats looked like specifically that early, right, Lauren? I mean, that would
Right.
be very difficult.
But we have indirect evidence.
Correct. So we don't know. It's sort of like, let me think about it this way. It's like if you have evidence for the existence of musical instruments, you have a flute or something, it doesn't tell you anything about the song that was played on that flute.
okay.
So we know that they had boats
Hmm.
just because of their ability to fish in these offshore environments. We know that there was not, for example, a radical transformation of the vegetation, because we've actually done much more extensively than many other projects in the Californias, analyzing the charcoal that we got our radiocarbon dates from. So we know, at least in the more recent phases of the project, right, Lauren, the species of plants that they're burning that are creating the charcoal. And it does not appear that there's a turnover in the broader kinds of plants that are there. They may have been more abundant or bigger or been lower in elevation, but it's the same vegetation community. Would you agree with that, Lauren?
Yeah, right. So if you're trying to figure out what are they making boats out of, yeah, there's not a cedar forest. There's not something else that would be more useful. It's very similar to as we see it today, we think.
Yeah.
Okay.
So
Yeah.
if the resources are similar, if what the raw materials that you have available to you are very similar today as they were, at this remote point in the past, you can't say anything definitively, but you can say, I don't see any particular reason why there would be a dramatic difference. Because if you're using the same raw materials, it's entirely plausible that you would have a similar solution, right? And that they would probably be using the driftwood that Lauren's talking about from this lumber yard as the main source. And given that this was an effective solution, it probably wasn't dramatically different. Well, I will say this, it's very interesting that when you look at those different species, people are asking, probably the listeners are talking about Cedros Island, right? When Francisco de Ulloa reached Cedros in January of 1540 and first called it Cedros Island, it had nothing to do with any of the plants that grew on the island. It was because he saw the driftwood there on the beach and then looked up with his primitive spyglass and saw that there were some trees on the tops of the mountains, which he never went up 3,000, 4,000 feet to look at, and saw that there were some trees, and then saw that the wood that he was looking at on the beach was cedar wood. And so he assumed that those must be cedar trees on the top of the island. But the cedars actually, as Lauren said, from a long way away. So
Mm.
Cedros is actually named for its driftwood.
Wow. Okay. Yeah, the reason I kind of bring this up, and this is like a maybe a good analogy, is at the contact period in the Lake Superior, Great Lakes area, they're using birch bark canoes.
Mhm.
Therefore, when we see settlements on islands in the Great Lakes in the Middle Holocene, we presume that they used canoes to get there, probably birch bark or dugout. But you know, with the dugout versus the birch bark, it would be hard to do a dugout canoe across the Great Lakes because they would get inundated with waves. While the dugout, you don't. Well, the idea is though, is that maybe the birch bark canoes, they have higher sides and they can take on waves better and they're lighter than the dugouts. And
Yeah.
but we've never found. That's just one place I've worked, and I've always talked to the Isle Royals National Park is where I've worked studying like old copper culture and their technologies, and they clearly made it out there by boat. Historically, they used birch bark canoes, but no one's ever found a boat on Isle Royal. We know they have Middle Archaic copper mines there, and so I always I'm like I can't wait for the day they find a sunken canoe with some copper in it. So, but what were you going to say about the dugout? You think they could be seaworthy?
I think
I
that,
guess the Polynesians are dugouts technically too. So,
well, and the Haida, the people from Haida Gwaii, for some of your listeners, sometimes referred to as the Queen Charlotte Islands, but today preferentially referred to as Haida Gwaii, off of the coast of British Columbia. That's what, 60 kilometers, Lauren, to the something like that?
I'd have to look it up, but you need a good boat to move around.
Yeah, it's not just, it's much further offshore even than Cedros is, and they're making exceptional canoes that even other tribal groups in the area would actually trade for to get a Haida canoe. And these are dugout canoes. And what they
mm,
do is they take the dugout and they just put higher sides on it. They just make
mm.
planks and then they sew those planks onto the dugout to make it have as high a freeboard as you want.
Okay.
Yeah, and so if you think about it, and the boats that the Maya were using in the Caribbean were dug out, canoes, and they're trading to the Caribbean islands. So, so I think what the difference is that people are looking kind of more localized, and they're saying, okay, this is what the dugouts looked like when they're also using the birch barks, and so the dugouts would be the more kind of expedient, less elaborate, a lot less, work maybe to generate, and for more inshore kinds of use, or calm waters or whatnot.
Yeah. Inland lake is what I would picture, a
Yeah.
river environment.
Yeah. And so once you've developed this new kind of version, then it's sort of like today, if somebody were to make a wagon to be pulled by a horse, it wouldn't be as good as the best horse pulled wagons that were being made in the 1850s. It's because you've kind of moved on to a new technology, and so the ones that you're still using are not, the maximum expression of that. So I think the dugouts are always a possibility because we see in different places around the world their capability. But I certainly think that the idea of that your idea about birch bark is also particularly relevant for those environments, because especially early on and under some environmental conditions, birch is a lot faster to grow than big trees that you can make a dugout out of. So you're going to be able to
Yeah.
have birch bark more quickly after the retreat of the ice than you are giant trees that you can make a dugout out of. And again,
Yeah.
it's back to what raw materials do you have available to you?
Yeah.
And especially in these northern latitudes, like the Great Lakes, you don't get really, really, really giant trees in some of those places because the snow brings them down before they get that big. And so those birch bark kinds of technologies, I think, are particularly well suited to that latitude and environment. So I would expect them to be pretty early there.
Mm. Yeah. And overall, boating technology is not even really a new thing in human history because I think there's evidence that Neanderthals boated to islands in the Mediterranean.
Hmm.
If I remember, I saw something like this that they think maybe there's evidence for Neanderthals and an island in the Mediterranean. I'll Google it and
Yeah,
I'll put it on the as an inset if it's true.
cool.
Not only maybe that's not totally accurate, but I know for a fact that people came to Australia across the Wallace line
Hmm.
very early in, let's say, Homo sapien history. And we're talking 50,000 years ago, we have evidence for people. And they certainly had taken a boat, even if sea levels were at their lowest extent, because that's that Wallace line that separates the marsupial mammals and the Southeast Asian mammals and other species. But yeah, so that means boats were being made by people for a long, long time. And I think those ones, if I remember also, the Neanderthals, the evidence is they were skin boats with skeletons of wood. They were like, yeah,
Coracles.
is that what you call that?
Yeah. It's sort of it's the bullhide boat, that's used in Scotland, Wales, Ireland, places like that for crossing
Okay.
rivers. Yeah, it's a sort of like a bowl. You make a bowl and then you just cover that with a bullhide.
So, but to be clear, that's the interpretation.
That's the interpretation.
They
There's no
they have
evidence for any of
they have
this.
not excavated a skin boat in the
Yeah.
Neanderthal period. So just to be clear to everybody, a lot of these kinds of discussions are about just sort of like making arguments about how we think it happened. And a
Yeah.
lot of it is just, making indirect arguments based on things like, people got to a really far island you couldn't walk to. They must have had a boat. So it's stuff like that. It's very reasonable. It's reasonable. It's logical, but the details of like it was a skin boat with wooden ribs. I mean, well, that's a
Yeah.
that's a supreme guess because we really don't know. We haven't seen that. But I think that to Matt's point though about what the early boats, just to bring it back to Cedros, what the early boats on Cedros may have looked like, I would not be surprised that they look like the ones that Ulloa observed, because there's a lot of that wood available, and also that kind of boat. There's a lot of natural analogs for that. You go to the coast and there's a log floating in the ocean, a driftwood log, and there's four seagulls standing on it. Although you get the idea, holy cow, that could be us. We could be on a boat.
Yes.
So
Yes.
it's not to say it's more complicated than that, but you get the idea.
Well,
Yeah.
yeah. I did a whole episode with Simon Scarpetta at San Francisco University about the Fiji iguanas. They had to have genetically come from, like, their closest relative is a desert iguana from North America. And there's no iguanas in the South Pacific, period. And so they thread their needle on a raft somehow, landed in Fiji, diversified in the nearby islands. And so a population of iguanas that could reproduce on top of that. But we know they go dormant, and desert iguanas can go months without drinking water. Other things, maybe not months, but a long time. But we also know that monkeys must have rafted from Africa to South America something like 30 million years ago across 1,000 kilometers. And this is probably attached to a tsunami or a mudslide raft of debris. So the reason I bring that up is we can see species moving to islands without necessarily having boating technology. Can just be like the Neanderthals on an island in the Mediterranean. Well, its sea level's low enough. Was it 20 miles away? Did they just hold on to a log and paddle themselves out to the island and then paddle themselves back? They could have done that,
Yeah.
maybe.
And it brings up an excellent point about because Lauren was talking about how you see people on an island that they couldn't have walked to. They must have had boating technology. Likewise, you sometimes see people say, "Oh, we have evidence for human presence, like an actual ancestor, remains or something like that that's on an island. Therefore, they must have been maritime adapted. They must have been fishing. They must have been all of these other things sort of inferred from that." And the problem is that sometimes an island is just the land part of it. I mean, there have been instances where people would, colonize an island, but then most of what they're doing there is farming and other sorts of terrestrial pursuits. And so I think if you really want to define things as being connected to particular life ways, you really have to look at what people are doing, not just whether they're there or not there. And I think that's key. That's really key because you
Yeah.
talked about how it transformed Easter Island, right? How that lack of ability to exploit broader environments around Easter Island then probably had a recursive effect upon the intensity of exploitation of the land resources themselves, which then creates a cascade failure of the system. And so when we're talking about really looking not just at, human history of the peopling of the Americas in a presence, absence, index fossil kind of way, but really trying to understand it as part of human history. I think we really need to dig deeper and understand what people are doing, because I sometimes see some people in the field mining for radiocarbon dates and just trying to find an older radiocarbon date, but not really telling us that much about what people are doing, because there's a lot of sites that are right around, Clovis age, and people have sort of not done enough to really flesh out what the lifeway was, what the anthropological understanding of that period is. And it's, I think, a mistake to only pay attention to the kind of oldest superlative kinds of things. It doesn't give you a full picture. Because as Lauren said earlier in our interview here, you're probably not going to find the earliest example of something. I mean, the odds of you finding the earliest example of something are so vanishingly small. To give you a very quick example, Lewis and Clark, who we've mentioned already before,
Hmm.
of the using their using their diaries and using their locational information that they provided as part of their expedition, they've identified securely, I think, 48 locations where, yes, Lewis and Clark were here, on such and such a date, based upon the canyons and the rivers and all of that, and even some of their astronomical observations. At those 48 locations, they've only been able to identify archaeological evidence of their presence at two. And one of those is the fort that they built on the coast of Oregon. Of the places where they were just kind of going through and camping for a couple days, the evidence does
Evidence.
not provide, and that's only 200 plus, 200 years ago.
Yeah.
And we're talking about 15,000 years ago.
Yeah.
So when we're talking about this, setting out with the goal of I'm going to find the earliest is probably like buying a lottery ticket, right? It could happen. You tell
Mm.
yourself that, but the odds are pretty small. On the other hand, if instead of trying to find the Lewis and Clark phase of the movement, if we try to think about this as we're going to find the Deadwood or the Dodge City or the, that kind of period of occupation and movement into a landscape, you have a much better chance of being able to understand the process. And so
What's
it's
going on
about
there?
looking for the settlement phase and maybe hoping, keep holding out hope that you find the exploration phase. But we can still learn a lot about the process and the direction and the movement and the culture of people by focusing on these settlement phase sites.
In Cedros is an example of a place that is all the material evidence suggests they are highly adapted to the marine environment. They, as you mentioned, have hardly any faunal material from terrestrial species are found, and they're exploiting huge deep water fish with newish technology on the scene that shows up around 20,000 years ago,
Mhm.
interestingly.
Yeah.
But yeah, that is interesting, and not to take it too far off subject, but it's so weird as you bring up, you look at the islands, you have to talk about how do they adapt. They could just be living on the coast, but they're not necessarily living off the marine resources. The same way, iguanas, just like Simon Scarpetta brought up. So we have the marine iguanas in the Galapagos, similarly rafted out there. And then we have the Fiji iguanas. The Fiji iguanas are totally tree born iguanas. They
Wow.
do not use the sea at all. They traveled 7,000 kilometers, ended up there, and they've completely adapted to the tree environment, high canopy environments. Whereas some iguanas show up in the Galapagos and they survive off the algae that lives in the shallow water
Hmm.
around and they can hold their breath. Their whole shape of their skull has been flattened so they can bite algae off of the rocks. And the shape of their face looks very much like a sea turtle, which has the
Interesting.
same adaptation to biting algae in the shallow rocks. It's the only lizard that is adapted to the marine environment.
That's super cool.
But what's on the island? Very few trees. So they show up and they have to adapt to eating algae under the water. And so in a way, then you're looking there, the Fiji iguanas make this whole journey and they don't have anything to do with the ocean anymore. And the Galapagos, these iguanas adapt to the water and they're just cool look. They're like multicolored. They almost look like they're red, black, and
Wow.
yeah, very, very weird looking iguanas, I guess. If you're
Well,
used to seeing a green ones.
and I think that that's an interesting parallel. Lauren and I were having a conversation recently, and I pointed out that one of the things that you see in a lot of populations that are settling or colonizing new landscapes is that they kind of practice a fairly generalized pattern, because you don't know for sure what's over the next hill, around the next, peninsula. You're kind of going to have to take what you can get, because you're not absolutely sure of what you're going to find. And so in a lot of cross culturally and globally, you see this fairly generalized pattern in early settlement periods. And given that, when you take different places, like you're describing the differences between the Galapagos and Fiji, I think similarly, you're going to have these generalized, highly skilled, but generalized hunter gatherers moving into the Americas. If you take them and you plop them down 400 miles up a river valley and have them do their thing, what the archaeological signature that they generate is going to look differently than if you put them down there on Cedros, where, much like those Galapagos iguanas, their options are limited. It's like, if you say no, I don't eat fish, you're going to have a hard time making it in central Baja California. And so you're going to inevitably move, more in that direction, just because that's what's on the menu, right? And so I think when we look at some of the differences between regions, we need to be a little bit deeper in our understanding, because somebody who goes to, a steakhouse is going to order something to eat, and that same person might go to a seafood restaurant and they're going to have something else just because that's what's on the menu. Uh,
Mm.
and similarly, generalized hunter gatherers are going to produce different signatures in different places. It's when you see, like you're talking about this, the beginnings and the evidence for specialization and refinement of these things, that you really can talk about localized patterns. But I think the ability of the Upper Paleolithic, a term that Lauren has introduced into our discussion of the Americas, Upper Paleolithic hunter gatherers in the Americas, one of the things that they demonstrate from the sites that we do have is an incredibly highly skilled form of hunting and gathering. These are not folks that are just kind of, to quote Bob Bettinger, picking things up off of the ground and putting them in their mouths. These are people who are really, really good, really know how to survive, really know how to adjust and adapt to different circumstances, know how to make their toolkit out of whatever stone they find. It could be high quality obsidian, or it could be the worst, crummiest quartzite you could possibly imagine. And they're still able to make these functional points that Lauren's talking about, having these similarities, these bifacial points. They're able to
Hmm.
make them out of, basalt. That I've seen some of these stem points from the Great Salt Desert of Utah that Darren Duke from Far Western found. I mean, they're just unbelievably well made, and they're using the awfulest stone you could imagine. Whereas then you see the Clovis points. Clovis people were really good, but they were stone snobs. They only used the really best quality, gemstone quality agate to make things. And so you see also these different patterns emerging about people who are still maintaining this flexibility, as opposed to people that are specializing. And Clovis doesn't really look like the initial entry pattern that we see. It looks like folks that have already figured out what they're doing and are really beginning to refine it into a localized pattern. Whereas the other sort of stem point traditions that we see at places like Cooper's Ferry and elsewhere really is a pattern that mimics what we see in settling populations in a lot of different places around the world.
Lauren, do you have anything to say about that? Do you want to add on anything? I thought for a second you were going to say.
No, Matt said it all.
Okay. um, Now, I kind of want to take this in a new direction. I want to maybe get back, like, think more broadly about human civilization, the development of societies in general, and let's call this social complexity. And emergence of social complexity among societies, and then our old world model, there's hunter gatherers, then they develop agriculture, we have surplus energy, specialists, and become sedentary societies. This leads to all the trappings of civilization and so on and so forth. Seems like a very simple model, especially for places that don't have agriculture and never had agriculture, or have people that live side by side with agriculture and never took it up. So this sounds like a case of complexity, social complexity is increasing with exploiting, and let's say, as energy source of the ocean. And we are using a technology like hooks and fishing lines that can get down there deeper. In South America, though, so I guess what I want to say is it seems interesting that social complexity, the earliest emerging bits of it, I feel like, are not driven by agricultural surplus. That model seems to be not capturing what's happening. It seems as though marine resources are more important in the early stages. And there's two examples I want to bring up and run by you too, because you are both experts, but not necessarily in this field. First is the example of the cotton domestication on the coast of South America in Peru. And this is a case where a plant is domesticated for its fiber, not because it's being eaten. And also, it's being grown in the interior regions, and it's being traded with coastal environments to make nets to exploit resources on the coast. And this leads to this development of trade between the cotton growers and the marine people on the coast. And this emergence of social complexity is not driven by surplus grain in the warehouse by the king. I want to talk about that one. And then I also want to bring up the case of the archaic copper miners in the Great Lakes area, which my own theory there is, the emergence of mining, and it seems intensive enough that we can detect it in lake sediments. And we have solid dates back to 8,000 years ago. The miners were clearly not dependent on agriculture. It's a very intensive activity. They're fairly deep and extensive, miles long. It raises a question out there: what did they live on that they could support that kind of society? And it sounds like my theory is they survived off the lacustrine resources of the Great Lakes, and they are on Lake Superior, some of the deepest water. And so a lot of the fish live in deep water there. One item we find very commonly around Lake Superior is hooks made out of copper. Copper is a material that's unlike anything available to the archaic people. It's malleable, unlike shells, unlike stones, unlike wood. And they can make very small, durable hooks for smallmouth freshwater fish in deep water environments. So I think in that case, here's another example of a technology unlocking an energy source that then feeds back into the society. Once they realized they needed this tech to get these deep water fish, it was a positive feedback that they needed the copper, because the copper is mainly utilitarian. I don't want to get into all that. They didn't use it for decorative purposes. Almost all of it's woodworking, fish, and projectile points. So it's clear agriculture was not involved in the earliest flickerings in the beginnings of social complexity around the world. Cedros is a clear example of that in my mind. But have you guys talked to anyone that's worked on the Peruvian sites and the development of the fibers down there for nets? I think it's a fascinating story because it also dates to like the very early Holocene and maybe late Pleistocene, if I remember right, right?
But let me just say before we get too far into this, that I would say there are multiple paths to complexity. So
Okay.
let's just not get
Yeah, let's
fixated
start
on
there.
one. Let's not get
Yeah.
fixated on one because, whereas I think, like you say, the secret is probably, can you harness energy in excess to be able to free people up to do other things? That's a big part of it. And how you get there can be through an approach to maritime resources or trade of cotton or the development of agriculture, because all those things are true. Some of the earliest evidence of complexity happens in places where there's not much fishing, like in the Near East or something in the desert, whereas other places it's, the northwest coast of North America, fishing is a really big deal, and that was the way. That was the way. So it's really more about a way. It's not that there's one way. There's multiple ways. So.
And I think it's what to dovetail off of what Lauren just said. It's more about the development of organizational structures, whatever the purpose of those is. You may need an organizational structure to coordinate the work at a mine, because if everybody's just kind of off on their own,
Hmm.
digging like badgers, that's
Hmm.
not necessarily going to give you the best results. So you might want to coordinate your activities, and you need to put some roof supports if you're doing adits and stuff like that to keep it from falling in on you. And that's helpful to have more than one person working on that. In the case of agriculture, making and maintaining irrigation ditches is a lot of work. And if everybody's personal field does their own irrigation pattern, that's going to impact other people's diversionary ditches. And so you kind of got to coordinate that, just like with boats. And I think that's really where, the kind of analogy crystallizes for me, because that's what I work on, is that, when you think about people launching and propelling a boat through the water, it has to be coordinated. If you're talking about people rowing a boat, everybody's got to be on the same stroke, or paddling a canoe. You can't all have your own rhythm. You've got to have the same rhythm of paddling, or you're going to start interfering with each other. And so that coordination of effort, whether it's mining, farming, or fishing, is really what that spark you're talking about. I think that's why it happens, is because people
Mm.
need to coordinate their action.
They need to coordinate their action. I like that. And I guess I've looked at other models like Joseph Tainer. His model is like it's to solve problems. Complexity initially arises because there's a problem, and problems are infinite to human societies. And so, therefore, if you take Tainer's model, these fish hooks and this stemmed notched biface was a response to a problem. Uh, do you have any comment on what that problem could be, or if you don't buy it, I'd like to hear that too.
Well, I think it's useful to think of these things through opportunity or constraint. Like you might say, is there a problem that we can solve that's keeping us back or holding us back? Or is it a problem of, it can even be things like, we would love to be able to have more people live in this space for a longer amount of time. Because that's usually the problem with foraging peoples, is that they'll eat everything in the landscape and then they cannot maintain their presence together with a high population. So they have to disperse into the landscape. But if you organize your labor in different ways, like we see on Cedros Island, and Matt can speak about this later, people start to develop these very large villages, and they're
Mm,
essentially like towns that the Spanish are describing. They have great descriptions of these things. And it's like, how is this possible? How could you get this many people together? Because they even settle in places where there isn't water. And so it's like, how in the world do you pull that up? They do it through, like Matt said, through organization. And so it could be that it isn't that the problem was that they needed to solve, like, how do we catch more fish? Well, that's only
mm,
useful if you're trying to do something like another issue, which is how do we get more people to live together? Because
mm.
that there's all kinds of benefits to that for trade and for security, and and also cultural reasons to want to live closer to your relatives and all these other things. So um, anyway, so I would think of
Yeah,
it that way. I was, it could be that it's a reaction to a problem in the environment, some catastrophe, but I often find that a lot of this is just people figuring out new ways to solve problems that may not seem like problems from the
yeah. Or they
outside.
they may not be aware that it's a problem until they've solved it, and they're like, "Oh wow, I could catch that fish way in the deep water I never could have caught before."
Or I spend 1 hour collecting a whole bunch of mussels, or I can spend 1 hour catching a 400-pound fish. It's like, what's the payoff? So you can look at it from that perspective too, like
Yeah,
economic payoff. But anyway, Matt, what can you add?
Well, I mean, for example, one of the things that um, I'll just say one of the things that hook and line does is it's actually much less labor intensive a form of fishing than either using nets or harpoons or any of the other methods that you can think of. There's a reason why people even today consider it a relaxing sport, because you go out there in the boat with your friends and you drop the line over the side and then you shoot the shit and
Yeah.
kind of are waiting for something to happen. And so it's a front loaded thing. Obviously, making the hook and the line is labor intensive in and of itself, but it's not something that requires the exertion of a huge amount of effort, and until you're pulling the fish in. And so one of the interesting things you can think about is that it enables a wider range of people to engage in the harvesting of these resources than otherwise would be possible. A 12-year-old can catch a fish, and a 65-year-old can catch a fish, but probably neither one of them is free diving for tuna.
Mm. Mm-hmm.
And so when you think about expanding the productivity of a population, is that expanding the accessibility of participation in that process is actually one of the big ways that you can improve the productivity. The more people that can participate in an activity, the better results you're going to get just by sheer numbers.
Hmm.
Whereas if there's things that are much harder to do, we talk about with hunting megafauna, it's like how many people are actually directly engaged in spearing that mammoth versus how many people can be directly engaged with, fishing for some, sea bass.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
And
yeah.
that's a big thing.
Yeah, you don't have to be in shape really, as to run around. I mean, God, I couldn't, like, using a Clovis point to spear a mammoth. Just Yeah, you'd have to be in shape and fast and strong and agile, and you probably still got messed up. So
Between the ages of 18 and 27,
yeah,
Well, you
yeah,
you probably just killed one mammoth once and you spent the rest of your life talking about it. So
yeah. That would have been a quite an achievement too. So they deserved it for sure.
but yeah, I think the problems that people solve, that to your larger point there from Tanner, is that I think that people create as many of their own problems through their purported solutions as exist,
Yeah,
yeah, as
I think
exist
he
in reality.
Yeah, he incorporates that the diminishing returns of complexity. The more complex the society gets, the return you get from another layer of complexity is not as good as the initial first complexity. And so you get like the situation of like the Maya deforesting, where it's just like they're so complex and so intensive that it just eventually makes it susceptible to collapse. Is kind of he's famous for that theory of collapse, and he has a couple of YouTube lectures I've watched. I'm not like in any way an expert in his theory, but yeah, that he does sort of get into the questions of complexity does create new problems, and that then require more and sometimes more complexity to solve them, and that can be very expensive for societies. And
You become path dependent,
mhm.
and so path dependency happens when, for example, like with the Hohokam in southern Arizona, it's pretty clear they actually were able to see the end coming
Hmm.
because of their diminishing, because of erosion, because of the return of the monsoons. They were able to see we are able to irrigate less and less and less, but they
Mhm.
didn't have a choice. They had to keep trying to maintain those same irrigation systems, even though they were able to see this is not going to work out. And so you're kind of, when you're able to perceive yourself, spiraling the drain, that's a
Mhm.
whole nother kind of scenario.
Mhm.
And so when the solution is not there yet, and so you have to keep going on the path that you're already on, that sort of illustrates the larger point. But
Mhm.
I think one of the things that happens with the difference between hunting and gathering and agriculture, there's a good poker analogy for that, right? Is that, hunting and gathering is sort of like, friends playing cards, of an evening in somebody's den, nickel ante, kind of situation. And agriculture is increasingly high stakes, up to when you're talking about large scale societies. You're playing the World Series of Poker, and you're all in every hand, because if you have large dense populations that do not have any sort of mobility, then a one season failure is famine. Whereas,
Yeah.
these hunter gatherers on Cedros, we go out fishing this morning. We didn't catch anything this morning. What are we going to do? Go back tomorrow?
Yeah.
And so you have another chance, and another chance. And there was the possibility of mobility that these boats enabled not only their initial entry and movement, down the coast, but then continued to enable them to, shift people from place to place. When the Spanish came, even the Jesuits were describing in the 1700s, there would sometimes be families of islanders living at some of the mainland villages, and not just visiting for a day, but like you'd go over there and live with your family for a few months. And so you can see people able to shift population around in these hunting and gathering situations. Even when you've got permanent-ish settlement of areas, you're still able to shift population. When you're talking about farming, that becomes less and less and less the
Mm.
more elaborate the farming system becomes, because you're not just throwing some seeds out there and waiting for them to grow. In a lot of these situations, you have to clear forest or irrigate desert or whatnot. And so those systems require constant maintenance. So you can't move. And so you've got to make it work. And it's about how much are you risking on each throw of the die.
A psychology of previous investment is another way I've heard of it. Once you're
Yes.
trapped in that system, like the Maya, they invested so much in that system to let it go. They knew it was going to go. And in Mirador, Richard Hansen says that you can find sites, houses that it looks like they just walked out the door. Like
Mhm.
the jars are just sitting there in the jungle still. And this is pre classic Maya. Like it's like a BC era. Um, but yeah, so I kind of lost what I was thinking there. But
Well, you had said you wanted to, there were two examples that you wanted to talk
oh
about.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. So the cotton, I think the initial rising of complexity, to a listener that's not familiar with the field of archaeology and everything, the old model was the agriculture, but I think it's very interesting that these late Pleistocene cultures are very dependent on the sources of energy from the sea. They're adapted to this with specific technologies that, like, cotton is the one I thought is fascinating, is because they domesticated it in South America. It's a fiber. You cannot eat it. You don't eat it. You only, which I think is a very important point. It was domesticated for its fiber, and then the fiber was not even that useful. I mean, you can make ropes up in the Andes for, I don't know what else, you maybe for their llamas or something, but they had to trade it to the coast where they made fishing nets where they were able to just rake in these huge schools of fish. And then they would trade the fish for the cotton. And it connected these two societies. And this is like a long time ago. And I think a lot of people, first of all, don't know that cotton's domesticated in South America. And it's one of the earliest domesticates in
Well,
the Americas, period.
parallel domestication there. I can't remember the exact date, but parallel domestication with gourds as well, which were being used as the floats for those fishing nets that you're talking about.
Really, I've heard that. And someone did bring that up to me one time. And I also heard the gourds were used as water vessels.
Sure,
So,
both.
but yeah, floats are, but yeah, they're used in water technologies. So that's another example of one being, I guess, not a specific food domesticate.
Right.
So, and then the I brought up the copper one where I think there's this idea of, how do you support hunter gatherers on their archaic societies mining copper? And some people debate that. I think it's solid evidence it's archaic. That's previous to agriculture. How do you support people on remote Great Lakes islands? It's cold out there. It's a deep water, cold water environment. My feeling is it's a fishing technology they needed the copper for. And that's why we also don't find much of it, because the technology is at the bottom of the lakes. We do find hooks, they're very common, but I think we'll find a lot. There are a lot more at the bottom of lakes than we think. And it's because they can make small hooks with metal. It's malleable. If you've seen freshwater fish, their mouth, as you both point out, is very key to the hook. And if you want to get whitefish, or if you want to get the lake's trout, you need to have a hook that's small enough to get in there and embed itself. I don't think you can do it with wood and bone. And so I think that unlocks this tremendous huge, I sound like Trump, uh, this huge resource of Lake Superior, because now you could get the deep water fish.
Mhm.
Lake Superior has these, before had these huge lake trout populations, and it's deep, cold water. You can't net them, you can't spear them. There are fish runs though. So that's what I thought was critical. And that is another example of this technology unlocking like a maritime slash lake resource,
Absolutely.
feeding into a social complexity. Metalworking, we only associate metalworking with sedentary societies. We do not typically associate it with hunter gatherers 6,000 years ago, even though it
Well,
wasn't smelting. But yeah, anyway.
but in all honesty, the really interesting thing about it is that if you look at hunter gatherers from these temperate to northern temperate environments around that time period, this is the Mesolithic in Europe, one of the best, most fun archaeological cultures to say, the Ertebülle from Denmark. These are hunter gatherers. They're these large villages. They're using copper in some cases in those villages too, usually as pressure flakers or other utilitarian kinds of things you see on the northwest coast. Um,
Yeah, that's another good
you know,
example.
they're using copper, and they even have those beautiful ceremonial artifacts made out of it. And it's again, I think one of the things that we see evidence for in all of, and the Jomon in Japan, since we've already talked about them, you're seeing really precocious development of technology. In fact, I know there's some debate now about one site in China, but you know how that competition goes. As far as I know, isn't because you've been there more recently, Loren, the Jomon still one of the earliest examples of ceramic technology in the world, right?
Yeah, ceramics are earliest in Japan. So
Mm,
And they're hunter gatherers.
mm,
This
mm-hmm.
is we're seeing really precocious development of technologies in a lot of these hunter gatherer situations, and the ones where you really see it are the ones where you mentioned the phrase surplus energy from these aquatic environments. A lot of times it's salmon runs or
Yes,
other kinds
salmon
of
runs.
really
Yeah, that's a
aquatic
good example.
marine environments where you're able to work for 1 month and harvest enough calories to sustain your village for the rest of the year, which then frees you up to do other kinds of developmental, artistic, types of activities. It's the same old pattern that they talked about how, the Greeks grew olive oil and wine, and that's what enabled the development of, the Pythagorean theorem, right? And so because you're able to produce a surplus and then have, labor freed up. And so I think in a lot of these situations, it's a very similar thing. So I think you're absolutely correct in talking about the Great Lakes situation as being what was it that enabled them to have the available extra, person hours to do
Mhm.
these things that are not, just baseline survival, because you
Right,
can survive in that environment. As interestingly enough, later time periods showed you can survive without doing all of that copper stuff. So, what was it that they were doing during that time period that enabled that extra labor and extra effort to
right.
be used?
Yeah, there's a huge debate in a huge for the archaeology world, the about the functional efficiency of copper. It's not much more functionally better than stone when it comes to spearheads and projectile points. That's another mystery, is that fish in cutting, lithic knives are pretty much as good as copper knives. Copper projectile points just as good as stone, lithic projectile points. So again, it raises a mystery. Why dig big mines? I've seen them. They're meters deep in this hard metamorphic basalt dug with stone tools. I mean, and miles long. What would do that? And they are not bringing up, and I wrote about it in my book that's behind me, but is the malleability hypothesis. Native copper is malleable. It can be
Hmm.
shaped into hooks. It's the only available material that would have been malleable. And so you can bend a small hook into a fish's mouth and extract these deep waters in the Great Lakes. That activated everything. That led to a positive feedback. I call it the lacustrine foundations of North American copper metalworking. Maybe it'll be published in a peer-reviewed journal one day, but it's way outside my wheelhouse. But no one's bringing it up because I don't know why. And that's what was unique about it. It wasn't its luster. That's another argument, is its luster. It's shiny. But then you would think that it was just made for decorative ornamental goods, but it's not the case. Almost all the archaic copper artifacts are utilitarian. They are used. They're not symbolic or ceremonial. Yeah.
We use it.
So
We use it a lot today in my experimental archaeology class. Every student gets a piece of copper.
really,
Yeah, for doing lithics. It makes for the best pressure flaker. So it's a copper pressure flaker is actually superior to an antler pressure flaker.
I didn't. That's amazing. Yeah.
And you can actually, because of that malleability that you're talking about, you can actually make a, pencil point pressure flaker for doing the regular work. And then you have a second one that you hammer into a screwdriver end. And that one is how you notch your projectile points. And so it's really the best material to make the notching tool for making projectile points. And no other material can replicate how good that is at that particular task. So I've seen people who want to replicate, really well everything. So they'll use a stone and an antler, and they'll use all the traditional stuff. But when it comes down to notching it, they'll pull out their copper notching tool because they don't want to mess around with breaking it at that stage. So you have
Yeah.
much higher success rates, much better results. You can notch deeper. And interestingly enough, you do see some of these, even ceremonial, but large scale, notched bifaces up there in the Great Lakes, Mississippi, Upper Ohio kind of area that do demonstrate some really skilled notching, much of which is
Mm-hmm.
probably being done with copper, either pressure tools, or even in as late as the Hopewell, they're using indirect percussion to notch some of those big, bifaces shaped like that then have the corner notches in them. Those are all indirect notching with copper. And so it's versatility of function, like you're talking about. You can make a fish hook out of it. You can make a knife out of it. You can make a pressure tool for doing other stuff. And
Needles,
needle,
amazing needle maker.
well, we were just talking about how
Yeah.
needles are key to living in that environment because
And
it's,
making for birch bark canoes too.
and the
They,
canoes. So copper may be in that environment, may be parallel to what the agave is in Baja California, because
there
we
we go.
already
That's,
mentioned the how
yeah.
it's the fiber source, but I
Yeah.
forgot to mention it's also, even according to the Jesuits, it's the major carbohydrate source for
Okay.
these people. So it's not only the fiber, it's also the carbohydrate. They also use the stalk for containers. You can also eat the flowers. You can also wait until it goes to seed and grind the seed into flour. The roots have a particular kind of textile quality that makes them ideal for basketry and other kinds of things. Literally every single piece of the agave plant was used in different ways by folks in Baja California. There's not a single part of that plant that's not useful. And since you mentioned needles, the tips of those leaves were
For
used as the
needles.
needles.
Okay.
So they've got
Yeah.
everything. So interestingly enough, we can think of agave as being kind of the total social phenomenon, to borrow a Mosian, thing for Baja California. That was kind of the center of mass for activity. And then in the examples you're talking about from the Great Lakes, it sounds like it wasn't all of the resources. Obviously, there's other ones, but that it may have been the center of gravity for the activity there during that time period in the Great Lakes.
Okay. Yeah. That makes, and then the cotton would be the equivalent for the Peruvian South American coast. So the
Yeah,
agave, the
or
cotton.
cotton slash llama wool. It's the
Yeah.
fibers,
Yeah. The
kind of in
fibers.
different. Yeah.
So we've been talking a little over 2 hours, and I think I want to maybe let's try to wrap this up, because I want to take it in a new direction for people out there wondering, where, like, if you could have any money, any funding, access anywhere, where would you look? Where do you think the best regions are to look to find early evidence of humans in North America, maybe even older than Cooper's Ferry? Where would you look?
Well,
Loren?
well, the lower Salmon River Canyon, which is where the Cooper's Ferry, the Baja site is at, there's a lot of places in that canyon that we now know have what we call the dirt of the right age. So that it's
Okay.
the landscape has built up over time in a way that is sort of contain these different layers that would have been surfaces that people would have lived on.
Mm,
Not all places, hold on to the dirt through time. You get a lot of erosion in places, and
yeah.
so some places are better than others. And the Salmon River Canyon is fantastic for learning more about this time period. And when I got started doing research there, I did a lot of work with the geology of the landscape, and we have radiocarbon dates that go into the 15, 16,000, 20,000, 30,000 years. I'm not saying there's archaeology associated with that,
Yeah.
but what we now know is that there are places that we could be looking that could also have earlier sites between, let's say, 15 to 20,000 years. And early on, I didn't really think much about it because I just thought that's just too old. They can't possibly be useful. And things have changed since then. So now we want to go back and start looking more at those kinds of places. Um, and then also, I think Cedros Island is also another place that could be explored a lot more.
Hmm.
Well, actually, I was going to say, because I think you've got the language to describe this concisely, Lauren. One area that I'll say what I would like to do, and then Lauren can explain it in detail. I would really like to know more about the nearshore environments and some of the flooded landscapes around Cedros to really have a better idea of the paleo landscape that would have surrounded the people, not only of the sites that we've already found, but potentially locations that may now be underwater, and understand that landscape better. I'm going to talk about the bottom profiling that we were talking about.
Hmm.
Yeah, so I mean, there's a whole world, of course, of archaeology that's underwater approaches, and usually you want to begin by doing surveys with geophysical instruments aboard boats and map the landscape really well, and then try to sometimes use instruments like the what's called sub-bottom profiler. You can look into the seafloor and try to even find buried archaeological sites. The only limitation I can see in Cedros is that you find these sites offshore, and then what are you going to do about it? So we'll put Matt in a shark cage down in the bottom there, and he can dig the sites for us while we sit at the
Yeah,
at the cantina. So
Yeah.
that is one difficulty with this location. It is one of the preferred and known haunts for large population of great white sharks
Okay.
because of all the sea mammal rookeries around here. So you really don't want to look like a seal and be in the
Yeah.
water.
Not a good thing.
anyway,
So you're thinking the Salmon River, Cedros, and maybe somewhere in an island off of the coast of Alaska. But like we mentioned earlier, the shapes of those islands would have been so vastly different
there's a lot to
that,
know everywhere. Honestly, you have
yeah,
many, many, many lifetimes of work ahead.
it would just be impossible to know, and that would be very hard.
I do. I'll say this. I want to find. I want to find a fish hook somewhere between Okinawa and Cedros.
That's an interesting one. Kind of like the missing link in a way.
Yeah, exactly. We need the site of the right age that has the technology somewhere between point A and point J. You know.
I was surprised that, I didn't realize about the stemmed biface points being a new thing in the 20,000 years ago. And I saw the pictures from your paper, Lauren, and the ones from Japan, to me, look very close to the ones found in America. So that to me is just the most remarkable finding, recently from your work
Yeah.
is
Well,
how close they visually look,
all these
you
things
know?
have to have an origin. Everything had to start
Yeah.
somewhere. So
And it seems like that is such a key moment in this story of the migration to Americas from Asia is the advent of the biface, and this fish hook technology. I think for anyone watching home, this is a totally new concept to them. Whether or not, it's coinciding or helped to open up that northern Pacific so they could actually make it that way. All we could say is it definitely coincided with the beginnings of the migrations to the Americas.
Yeah, and it doesn't even
Yeah.
have to be, individually specific technologies. It's more about what that tells you about what's going on inside people's heads. It tells you about the knowledge systems that they have, and that they're funds of knowledge that they're transmitting from generation to generation. Really, as Lauren said earlier, it's these things that we're finding are just the material manifestations of, the traditions, culture, ideas, concepts, and innovations that are up here. This is just the residue of that, but we're trying to really figure that out. And if we see, even if the specific fish hook, is an independent, development, what we can say is that there is a very strong adaptation in the Western Pacific on the coast of East Asia that is there prior to any evidence that we have of people in the Americas. And now we're finding between sites like Triquet Island in British Columbia and Cedros and even further down that many of the very earliest sites on this side are also showing this evidence. And so whether it's, multiple groups of people coming in, maybe there's some people that are more, river adapted and they're moving in. And then there's some people that are more coastally adapted. Maybe you've got, a diversity of population moving in. But I think we can say that part of that, movement is being accomplished by people who are part and parcel of this Western Pacific tradition where the exploitation of aquatic resources is a very familiar thing without having to claim that this fish hook equals this fish hook. It's just they're
Mm-hmm.
part of these larger, broader cultural traditions.
Mm-hmm.
And look, there's one here.
So what is it? Tell us what that is.
Oh, I just made this earlier, so this is kind of to give an idea. This is similar to some of the stemmed points that we find on Cedros. So it's not like the ones that Loren has from Cooper's Ferry, but
They're that
it's
small? Is that to scale too? That small?
Yeah.
On
Loren.
Cedros?
Yeah, they're pretty small.
Wow. So those almost look like an arrowhead, a proper arrowhead,
Well, they're
not a
they're a
project.
little bigger than that.
Then a
But,
arrowhead. Okay.
Yeah, that's over an inch long. So yeah, that's
Whoa. Okay, because this is like a reverse. It's like small, and then they went to like Clovis and like Paleo Indian. They're like pretty big, and then they shrink down again
big
in the
ones
late archaic.
are made too. So there's
Okay,
big
they
ones
make
that
big
get
ones.
made and small ones, and they're probably being
Okay.
used for different things. But
I think it's like the hooks, just certain fish. But also
Yeah.
the
Yeah.
other thing to keep in mind is that even with the Paleo Indian fluted traditions, those really large ones like from Wenatchee and Washington, those were
Mm-hmm.
never intended to be used. Those were placed into a ceremonial cache, and so
Mm.
they were made specifically for that purpose. A lot of the Clovis points are, Lauren, right, like 2 inches long, maybe.
yeah,
Wow.
a lot of them are small.
Okay.
Anyway,
Nice. All right. Well, it was a wonderful conversation, guys.
thank you
Thank
very
you so
much.
much.
I appreciate the invitation sincerely.
I hope to see more work coming out of Cedros in the upcoming years. I follow all the press releases on anything early American archaeology. So if it comes out, I usually try to follow up on it.
Fantastic.
Yeah, for people that are watching, please. I have a lot of people showing back up to watch these videos, but if you could subscribe to my channel, if you like it, that would help out so much with the algorithm. Or a good old like or comment is also helpful. If you can comment with people that you want to see being interviewed, scientists, that would help me out so much. I'm getting some helpful feedback on stuff people want to see. But yeah, send me a comment below to let me know what you think about this conversation and any potential guests. Anything you want to say to end us off, Matt and Loren? Any shout outs, any field schools you're running?
I will make a shout out to the National Institute of Anthropology and History of Mexico, without whom we would never be able to do our work either legally or practically. They have been a support for me for 25 years now, and especially people like Julia Bendimes Patterson, especially our colleague Antonio Porcayo Michelini, who's a member of the National Consejo and a co-director of our project, who is essential to all of the success. And I just want to say thank you to them, and obviously to the people of the community of Isla Cedros, who have also treated us with friendship and hospitality for such a long time. And we deeply appreciate all of their assistance.
Great. And
Yeah, and
Loren?
of course, I echo those same sentiments. But in Idaho too, I want to give thanks to the Nez Perce tribe for their support of the work that I do there in the canyon. Also to the Bureau of Land Management; they've been our partner for a really long time. And the Coopers Ferry site that we've been talking about is managed by the Bureau of Land Management, and it's part of the public lands that we all enjoy in the United States. And there's an incredible amount of archaeological heritage knowledge that relates to specifically this person, this case, but it tells us more about our nation. And that stuff's really important. So, but thank you also, David, for inviting us.
Yes.
You're welcome. Okay, guys, I think we'll sign off. And until next time, have a good one. Bye.
Thank you so much.